Okay, Parsha Semor Perik Chof Aleph Posuk Aleph. Yomer Hashem Moshe Emor El Kohanim B'nei Aaron. You should say to the Kohanim B'nei Aaron. V'marta Aleim LeNefesh Lo Yitameh Ba'amov. A nefesh is not permitted to contaminate himself Ba'amov. What is Ba'amov? Within his people. So Rashi addresses it all. Emerald Kohanim, Emor v'amarta. What's the reiteration? You should say then v'amarta lahazir gedol maktanim. Meaning that although a minor is not bound by laws, but the adult has to be careful that the minor Kohen should not become contaminated. B'nei Aaron, yochel chalolim. What about if a Kohen is a cholo, meaning he's a desecrated Kohen? A Kohen marries a divorcee. Where the Torah tells us when he marries a divorcee, he marries a zona, a defiled woman. The Torah says he's not permitted, because it says, Lo yichalel zaro. He's not permitted to desecrate his seed. Therefore, if he's not a Kohen, he's a cholol, although he's ben Aaron, the laws of contamination don't apply to him. B'nei Aaron avbali moving b'mashma. What about a Kohen who cannot officiate because he's blemished? He's not permitted to contaminate. B'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron. These laws only apply to the male, not to the female. The daughter of a Kohen. Lo yitameh ba'amov. What does it mean? He should not contaminate when he's within his people. Ba'od shames b'toch hamov. Meaning, if there are others who are there to attend to the needs, the burial needs of that corpse, yotzem es mitzvah. But if the corpse is a mitzvah, there's no one else to attend to his needs, that becomes an overriding factor. And a Kohen could contaminate, we'll see in a moment, even a Kohen Gadol, who's not permitted to contaminate even to the 7 closest relatives, even if the Kohen Gadol is a Nazir, who a Nazir is not permitted to contaminate to the 7 closest relatives, compounded. Kohen Gadol, Nazir, if he comes upon him as mitzvah, it becomes an overriding factor. He has to attend to the burial needs of the mes mitzvah, of that person who's lying, not being attended to the burial needs of that person. So the ordinary Kohen is not permitted to contaminate the remains of any, even a Jew, but there are exceptions. Kim l'shera korov, Elov, but though the person who's closest to him, meaning Shera always indicates or alludes to where the connection is through flesh. We're speaking about a wife, Li'imo la'oviv, to his mother, to his father, Livno labito, to his son, to his daughter, La'ochiv, and to his brother, V'la'chosa psula krov Elov, and to his sister who's a virgin, who's krova elov, we'll see what this who's close to him, which she's not married to a person, to an ish. Doesn't make them two. She can be married to a Kohen, to a Levi, to Israel. Lo yitamo. To that sister, he's obligated to contaminate. Hakrova, the sister he's close, larabus is arusa. Although she's betrothed, which is marriage, but since she hasn't yet engaged physically with the husband, the marriage has been fully consummated, he contaminates her. Ashlo hoysel li'ish li'mishkov lo yitama mitzvah. Okay. What exactly is death? What death is a result of the Eitzadas. Hashem had said to Adam that the day that you eat of the tree of knowledge, most tomos, you will be subject to death. Doesn't mean you will die instantaneously. You'll be subject to death. Before the Eitzadas, Adam was meant to live eternally. At Sinai HaKabbalah Torah, who are the Kohanim? Who are meant to be the officiants, the Bechorim? The firstborn were meant to be the Kohanim. But as a result of the Chet Egel, all Jews became tainted with that evil of idolatry. They reverted back to post-sin, and they were disqualified. The only Shevet that did not participate in the Chet Egel was Shevet Levi. When Moshe Rabbeinu said, Mi Lashem Eloi, who's for God should come with me, it was Shevet Levi. And Rashi cites Chazal, there wasn't one Levi from that tribe who participated in the Chet Egel. Aaron was chosen to be the elite of Shevet Levi. Aaron is a Levi, but in addition, Levi is a Kohen. That's why the Gemara tells us that Maser, when you tithe the produce in Eretz Yisrael, you give 10% to the Levi. The Kohen qualifies to receive the Maser because the Kohen is also a Levi. But the Kohen is a more advanced level of Levi. He's called Kohen. He's the officiant. What is death? Death is a representation of the Chet Egel. If Klaus wouldn't have sinned with the Chet Egel, we would have had no relevance to death whatsoever. The Chorim would have been, the Jews would have lived eternally. We only reverted to post-sin that was subject to death only because of the Chet Egel. The Bechorim would have remained to be the what? To be the Kohanim. They were the officiants. They were only disqualified because they would participate in the Chet Egel. The Kohen was the replacement for the Bechor. So the simple understanding, the Bechor, the Kohen, is not permitted to engage with anything that has relevance to the Chet because he was not part of that Chet. He did not participate. So why is the Levi or Kohen subject to death as every other Jew? Because that's Klal Yisrael. Because Klal Yisrael, being part of Klal Yisrael, you're subject to that. Just give you an example. We find that when the Jews were counted in the Midbar, the Jews were counted from the age of 20 and above. The Levim were counted from the age of 30 days and above. The Levim. All other Jews were counted from the age of 20 when they were eligible for conscription. Why? So Rashi over there cites Chazal that because Levi is Legion Shel Melech, they're the legion of the king, he says they should not be counted together with the other Jews. They're counted differently. All other Jews are counted from the age of 20. And then Rashi says that because the Jews ultimately were going to sin with the Chet HaMeraglim, the story of the spies, and since they're not being counted as part of that, when the decree was that anybody from the age of 20 and above should pass away over this 40-year period, since they were not part of that counting, the decree did not go on them. So Hashem had to count them separately. So when the decree of death came upon Klal Yisrael, it did not come upon Legion Shel Melech, the legion of the king, which are the Levim. Levim did not die during the Midbar. Only the ordinary Jew. The Chet Egel, the decree was what? It impacted Klal Yisrael. The Levi is part of Klal Yisrael. The Kohen is part of Klal Yisrael. So in terms of being subject to death, they were impacted as every other Jew was impacted. But in terms of participating in the Chet Egel, which brought about death, they were not participants. Therefore, Hashem says, you people, I don't want to be tainted. With what? With coming in contact with the dead. However, the 7 relatives I allow or even obligate. It's a mitzvah. So the question is why? Because we'll see in a moment, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, he's not even permitted to contaminate himself even to his 7 closest relatives. What's the difference between the Kohen Gadol and the what? And the ordinary Kohen? The halacha is that we just had this, after Nadav and Avihu were struck down by Hashem, the halacha is an onain. An onain means a person the day before the burial of a person. He's classified as onain. After burial, he's classified as ovil. And the question is the day that the burial takes place regarding a Kohen. He's called an Onain. A Kohen who officiates, the avoda is not valid. Not valid. A Kohen Gadol who officiates as an Onain, the avoda is valid. Is valid. And that was also with Aaron. And since Aaron was the one who officiated, therefore, as a result of that, the avoda was what was valid. Eating kochim, to eat the sacrificial meat, even the Kohen Gadol does not eat if he's an Onain. But in terms of the service, the avoda as an Onain, a Kohen Gadol, he's not diminished due to being an Onain. And that's why Aaron's service was valid. So burning the korban, they had to burn the korban because it wasn't fit for eating. But in terms of the service was valid service because Aaron, being the Kohen Gadol, being the high priest, he was qualified to do the avoda. But an ordinary Kohen, if he's an Onain, he's not qualified to do the avoda. So why do we differentiate between the Kohen, ordinary Kohen, and the Kohen Gadol? So here he says something interesting. The Seforno says that an ordinary Kohen, factually, although Hashem doesn't want him to come in contact with the dead, but what does the Kohen represent? The Kohen represents, we find, he is the ultimate disseminator of Torah for Klal Yisrael. He has to have a certain level of representation in the eyes of Jews. He has to be considered choshuv. He has a certain degree of distinction being the Kohen. He was chosen to be the elite. If he goes and he contaminates himself to every family, automatically that's a diminishment of his status, and that aura which Hashem wants he should be perceived and seen with this special level of distinction will be minimized. Therefore, Hashem says, you cannot contaminate yourself with the dead. However, your seven relative, which is for your own family, that would not be considered a diminishment. That's the reason. So the ordinary Kohen, who's a disseminator, he represents the dissemination, representation of Hashem's presence. He should not be diminished and minimized by being involved in all this kind of involvement, attending to the burial needs of people. But his own family, he's not seen as being minimized, and therefore the Torah says you're obligated. But the Kohen Gadol, on the other hand, he's not even permitted to contaminate himself even to his closest relatives. So you see clearly, it's not a question of minimization because it's the perception of who he is, but rather it's something other than that. It's other. So we discussed this in the past. Who is the Kohen Gadol? Who is the Kohen Gadol? The only one who's qualified to go into the Kodesh Kodashim, which is the location of the Shekhinah, only once a year is the Kohen Gadol. An ordinary Kohen's not even permitted to go there. The Kohen Gadol is permitted. A Kohen Gadol is not permitted to marry a woman that an ordinary Kohen is permitted to marry. For instance, an ordinary Kohen is permitted to marry a widow. A Kohen Gadol is not permitted to marry a widow. Not only is not permitted to marry a widow, if a woman is not a virgin, he's not permitted to marry her. But a Kohen, an ordinary Kohen, is permitted to marry a virgin. What exactly does the Kohen Gadol, what does he represent? So we had discussed a Kohen Gadol, what he represents is Odom Kodem Achet. Odom, pre-sin, there was no such thing as death. Death didn't exist. It was only a consequence of ingesting the Eitz Hadas, which was Ra. Because Ra, that evil became part of the human being and became part of all humanity, that's why people are subject to death. So the source of the contamination of the dead is the Ra, is the evil. The Kohen Gadol representing Odom Harishon, which was pre-sin, who had no relevance to death, therefore, even to the seven relatives, he's not permitted to contaminate. Pre-sin, it's the question, who is the woman he marries? She was never married before. She's fully intact as God created her. Chava, Odom and Chava. She was a perfect woman at the time of creation. This is the only woman he's permitted to marry. As Odom initially had the direct contact, he was in the Gan Eden. before the Chet, only the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is he permitted to go to Kodesh Kadoshim, the location of the Shekhinah, because he is that level of representation. He is the ultimate Odom. When we became Atem Kriyim Odom, Heim Lo Kriyim Odom, that classification, he is the pinnacle of Odom. Now it's interesting. Normally, Vidui, you just had this in last week's Parsha, when a person does tshuva, he has to make an oral confession. When he brings his korban, we spoke about the Selah Zozel. There was the goat that carried all the sins of Klal Yisrael, and the Kohen Gadol, he would put his hands on that goat, and he would confess all the sins of Klal Yisrael. We know that there's such a thing known as mitzvah shebegufo. There's certain mitzvahs which cannot be delegated through an agent. You can't delegate somebody to put on tefillin for you. You can't delegate somebody to eat matzah on your behalf. You have to eat the matzah, you have to put it tefillin on your own hands. Vidui, oral confession, it has to be with the person himself. You have to make that verbalization. For instance, the Gemara tells us, smicha, when the person brings a korban and you lean on the korban, which is part of the ritual for the korban to atone for the person who brings the korban, has to put his weight on the korban. Smicha, leaning on the korban, cannot be delegated through an agent. The person who brings the korban, he himself has to actually lean on the korban. That's called mitzvah shebegufo. But yet we find that the Kohen Gadol, he does the smicha on behalf of the Jewish people for the Salah Azazel. It carries all the sins of Klal Yisrael. So the answer is, if you take a look in the Ramban in last week's reading, what does the Kohen Gadol represent? He's an embodiment of the whole Klal Yisrael. It's, as we're saying now, the Kohen Gadol is the Odom. Odom is the father of humanity. He's the representation of the person, Kodem Aschet, before the sin. He encompasses everything. As a result of that, he's the representative of Klal Yisrael, even in regard to smicha. So when he leans on that animal and he confesses the sins of the Jewish people, it's the equivalent of all the Jewish people confessing their sins. So he's not a shliach, it's just a shliach. He's an embodiment in terms of representation, not because they appointed him to be the agent, but he is that essence in terms of what he represents. Therefore, his vidui, his confession, is the equivalent of the confession of the whole Jewish people for that reason. So that's the distinction between the ordinary Kohen and the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol officiates even when he's a no-name, even the day, even pre-burial of his closest relatives, because he represents the concept of death has no relevance to the Kohen Gadol. The ordinary Kohen, if he officiates when he's a no-name, the service, the avodah is not valid. Because since the avodah has to be in that special level, and the onaim being associated with death at that time, therefore he's not qualified. He has to wait till that day passes. The Kohen Gadol that day has no relevance to him. Because he represents something which death has no relevance to that person, for that reason. However, I'm dealing with a mes mitzvah. You've come upon a Jew who is burial needs, there's no one to attend, and he lies in disgrace, which is what we call the schil Hashem, because this person, the remains of the person, the neshama of the person is still associated with his body until he's interred in the ground. If it's at that level, that becomes the overriding factor. And the same thing with the Nazir. He's a high priest, he's a Nazir compounded. If he comes upon the mes mitzvah, that becomes the overriding factor. Because that is attending to something which is the ultimate, is because there's no one to attend to that neshama, which has to depart, and then only departs when it's interred, when you attend to its burial needs. Therefore, that becomes a sufficient reason why that overrides the Kohen Gadol and the Nazir.
I have a few questions, Rabbi.
As uvesaram lo yisu sarotes. You're not permitted to lacerate your flesh as an expression of grief for the dead. This is mentioned also in Dvarim, and over there it says, "Ki bonam atem l'Hashem Elokechem." because you're God's children. Now, why does a person lacerate his body when he's grieving? He's experienced a level of pain, of hopelessness, to the degree he can't contain himself. And therefore he starts tearing at his flesh. So the Sifaro says over there, why does a person feel that he's in this hopeless state when the person dies? A loved one dies, whoever that person dies. Because he feels without that person, life can't continue. He says, maybe why? Maybe you're paying for the person who died. He says, the person who died is going to a better place than he is in this world. Because if a Jew believes that there is an Olam Haba, there's a world to come, and the world to come, we say that a Koras Ruach of Olam Haba, just a whiff of the world to come, since Pirkei Avos is more than the whole this world. So what are you grieving over that? You can't be grieving for the person who died. So maybe you'll say you're grieving for yourself, that you no longer have that person there to provide whatever he provided. But you God's Am Kodesh, you're a holy nation. You have a relation with Hashem. If that's the case, it's never hopeless, because we always have Hashem. So grieving to the point where you can't contain your pain, either for the person who died or for yourselves, it's contrary to what the reality is of where you are and who you are. If you believe in Hashem and you believe you are Goy Kodosh, God's your father and you have this connection to him, God is not going to abandon you. Whatever the father is, whatever the deceased is, it's not comparable to what the relation with God's concern for us. So why are you grieving to this degree? Therefore, every laceration a person makes to express this grief is a Torah violation for that reason.
I mean, is it at the level of being idolatrous?
No, it's not idolatry. It's not idolatry. You accept another deity. You're not accepting a deity.
Right, but you're denying.
If a person doesn't. Let me explain something.
I'm sorry.
To internalize something is very difficult. To internalize something, meaning we believe in schar v'onish. There's such a thing as rule and punishment. Yet we cross lines continuously. But yet, if it would be corporal punishment, we wouldn't cross those lines. And Gehenim, the punishment, the world to come, is a lot worse than anything in this world. But yet we cross dances to internalize something of that is very difficult. So you'd say this concept of feeling that we are the Jewish people and we have God there for us, not giving up hope, not feeling abandoned. Every Jew has relevance to that. And we should have relevance to that, minimally to that. So to go to such an extreme that you feel at such a loss, that you feel you've been abandoned, you start tearing at your flesh, even though you're not at that special level, it's something which is unacceptable. Okay, we're ready for the halacha.